Hello? Can you hear me? Nope.
And my audio is not working either. Let's try that again.
Hello?
Oh, wow.
Hello?
It's just one thing after another. Just a moment. Let's see what I can do to make this work. Just running the troubleshooter. Sorry. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
And I can hear you. Excellent. All right. Yep, just a driver's issue. It decided, there we go. Can you hear me? Worked fine at lunchtime, decided not to work in the evening because, computers.
Rob, I think if you post the link in the WhatsApp, people find it easier. That might be why.
I did post it in the WhatsApp.
You did?
Yep, just after your reminder. I was coming home after having to clean up the art room, and that's why everything was a bit late, and just did not do my usual checklist, to refer to my most recent sermon, on the different steps that were needed. But it's up there now, so hopefully other people will be able to join once they find it. But there we are. Oh, that's too far back. We need chapter 3, Mishnah 1. Let's get just a little bigger for my eyes. Forgot, actually, that just recently, Safaria had upgraded their system to allow you to increase the font. It doesn't increase the margins, unfortunately, but at least it makes the font bigger without having to make everything else bigger too. Okay, so with technology, with delays and all of the things now behind us, we are able to dive in to chapter 3. I'm never going to get sick of that joke when dealing with Mikvaot. We get to go into our discussion of chapter 3. And in chapter 3...
Before starting, can I ask you something not related to the Mishnah?
You can, but I reserve the right to tell you that we'll talk later. Go ahead.
Okay. I forgot that rabbis are also lawyers. No, can you check in your cell phone or in your house, anyone, if they open the weekly bulletin, if the picture in your cell phone, if the pictures are the picture that our men's club picture in the activity, if it looks well formatted or not, because in the computer I saw it perfectly, but I received an complaint from someone else that looks like in his cell phone looks very bad. So I need to double check if it was maybe the cell phone or the computer.
Do you mean the picture of us at the
Yes.
the beer outing, that one?
Yes, that one.
No, that looks fine on my phone.
Really?
Yeah, and the flyer for the upcoming bowling looks fine. Yeah, the
No, you're
picture
right.
of us having our beer is very nice.
Well, looks like maybe it's an issue on his sides.
It
On
is
his
hard.
end.
Yeah, it's hard to get the technology to be perfect for everybody's phones. So, but yeah, it looks fine on mine. I'll check with my Penelope and the other members of the family and see whether I can identify that some phones don't do it, aren't as happy. But yeah, it's fine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. That was a short question with a short answer. Those are perfectly fine. Okay. Now let's get wet in the mikveh, chapter 3. We're just going to jump in with Rabbi Yossi's statement because I think it'll be clear what we're talking about just from him. Rabbi Yossi says, 2 mikvahs, neither of which contained 40 seahs, and a log and a half of drawn water fell into this one, and a log and a half fall into this one. Let's get that basic situation down. We've got 2 mikvahs. They are side by side. Don't ask why we have 2 mikvahs side by side. Don't ask how they made it. That's not important. What's important? What's important is that we have 2 mikvahs, and each of them is below the 40 seah minimum. Remember, it has to be up to 40 seahs of that mayim chayim, of that non-drawn water, and that will then allow it to remain kosher, even if you add extra. But at this point, we're under that point where we don't have that quantity. And a log and a half falls into each. Now, why a log and a half? Because it's when it reaches 3 logs in one mikvah that it is disqualified. So here we have 2 mikvaot under 40, each of them only getting 1.5, which means each of them so far are still potentially a kosher mikvah. Everybody following the plan? Okay. And then they are mixed together. So imagine you've got your 20 seah mikvah next to each other. You put a log and a half into each, and then you remove the barrier between them. And now the water swoosh becomes completely mixed between both of them. And what's the ruling? They remain valid, since they had never been called as invalid. So since each mikvah independently was never not kosher, even though the total amount of drawn water that was put into both of them independently, half and half, would have been enough to render one mikvah invalid, because it was put into 2 separate quantities and rendered neither of them invalid. Even when they combine, which would mean that there is a total of 3 log of drawn water in that combined quantity, it doesn't matter. They are still, it can still become a valid mikvah. Even if you had 1 seah and 1 seah that now are mixing with a total of 3 log of drawn, because of the way it was put into each of them independently, since neither of them became invalid, the combined is not invalid.
Sorry, I missed that.
No,
So
that's okay. It's confusing.
you have 2 mikvaot that neither of them was with the minimum necessary.
Correct.
And when you combine them together, yes, they are the minimum necessary together. So then they are still invalid? No, they are not. They are kosher now.
Right. Well, so it doesn't really matter whether they are combined more or less than 40 seahs. That's not relevant. What matters is that mikvah A was always a potentially kosher mikvah, and mikvah B was always a potentially kosher mikvah. Neither A nor B had too much drawn water to make it now invalid.
But
So
they
when they
didn't have
mix,
enough water to be kosher because either was under the minimum. So why they were kosher, they were potentially kosher if they were under.
so that's what I mean by potentially kosher. If let's just use one number, let's say 10. If mikveh A had 10 seahs of water, and you
Yeah.
put a log and a half of drawn water into it, mikveh A isn't kosher yet, but it could become kosher if you continue to add non-drawn water, mayim chayim. So it
Okay.
hasn't been disqualified yet. It is not pasul. It's not kosher yet, but it's not pasul. It's not invalid. And mikveh B, the same rule, because it hasn't had too much put into it of the drawn water, it is still potentially kosher, meaning that it is not invalid. I hate using the double negative of not invalid, which is why it's nice in Hebrew, lo pasul. It's not pasul. It's not kosher. Therefore, when you
Not
combine
cancel.
them, right?
Not
When
cancel.
when you combined them,
Pasul.
you are making a not canceled mikvah combined with a not canceled mikvah, and the result then is not canceled. It's potentially still fine. And it doesn't matter that the new total has had a 3 log of drawn water added to it, because what was added to each independently does not combine to create a total that you would use to invalidate the total of the rest of the water.
But it's not the same. That's not normal that every mikveh that is under the level has the potential to be kosher if you bring a more high mayim chayim.
Well, no. If I have a mikvah with 10 seahs of water, and then I put 3 logs of drawn water into it, that mikvah, it cannot, and then I add another 30 seahs, 50 seahs, 100 seahs of mayim chayim, of good water, it's never a kosher mikvah. Once you put 3 log of drawn water into the mikvah, before it reached the 40 seah minimum, it is pasul, it is invalid permanently until you drain the water and start all over again.
So the first time you need to have the minimum necessary, the first time.
Exactly. You have to hit 40 seahs of mayim chayim, of good water, before drawn water is added to it in excess of 3 logs. Once
Okay,
you
got
add
it.
more than 3 logs, before you hit the 40 minimum seahs of mayim chayim, then the whole mikvah needs to be drained and you start all over again. So what's novel here is, and what is counterintuitive here, is that even though the combined drawn water from mikveh A and mikveh B is 30 log, because the identity of each mikveh is independent, as long as mikveh A is still potentially kosher and mikveh B is still potentially kosher, when they mix, the resulting mikveh is still potentially kosher. So the drawn water loses its identity once it enters mikveh A and mikveh B, and it does not add to itself when the barrier between them is removed. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, is there a presumption that the drawn water goes into the mikvah last, that they combine last?
No. We saw last week that according to the Chachamim, it doesn't matter whether the drawn water is first or whether the drawn water is in the middle or whether the drawn water is at the end. If it is under the minimum of 3, then it's perfectly fine. Or I guess maximum would be the, but if it's under the maximum of 3, then it's fine. And if it's over the maximum, regardless if it was at the beginning, middle, or end, then it is not fine. You have to hit 40 seahs of mayim chayim, of the right water, before you go over the 3 log of drawn water. Once you have the 40 seahs and of the mayim chayim, then you can add additional water to your heart's content.
Right. No, I was talking about when you combine the two. Is there a presumption when they're combined that the drawn waters enters the mikvah last?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Is there like a presumption that somehow the drawn water in each of mikveh A and mikveh B is entering the shared space in a different order than the rest of the water that is Mayim Chayim. Is that your question?
Yes.
No. It's more to do with the identity of each mikvah. That as long as mikvah A is still a potentially kosher mikvah, then adding it to another potentially kosher mikvah results in a potentially kosher mikvah.
But if I'm reading this wrong, then when you combine two potentially kosher mikvahs that don't equal 40 selas, they become invalid if they both have a 1.5 logs each.
If you one more time.
If they have less than 40 selas of water, it invalidates them. If the combined total is less than 40, it's invalidated.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't say that.
Huh?
It says that each of mikvah A and mikvah B has less than 40 sayas, but it doesn't tell us how much less they have,
right.
And thus it doesn't tell us how much they have when they are combined.
All right.
That's an unspoken variable, and as such, it appears to be not relevant. Let's do the second half where we'll see the counter version, and maybe that'll make it clearer. But if there is a mikvah A, holding less than 40 sayas, and 3 logs of drawn water fall into it, and it was then divided into 2, it is invalid, since it had already been called invalid. So if you have a less than 40 seah mikvah, and you put 3 logs of drawn water into it, well, that is invalid. You might think, well, if I put a board between them and make 2 mikvahs, then now it's as if there was 1.5 of drawn water on the left and 1.5 drawn water on the right. And since that's less than the 3 maximum that's allowed, then the 2 mikvahs on either side, I can go ahead and keep filling with Mayim Chayim and they'll be kosher. And according to Rabbi Yossi, no, it doesn't work like that, because once mikvah A becomes invalid, you cannot divide it into 2 potentially valid mikvaot by splitting it up in half. That once it's invalid, once the water is no longer kasher, once it is pasul, then anything you do with it is going to be pasul, is going to be invalid. So drain it and start again.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Just to clarify, invalid doesn't mean impure, right?
Correct. Invalid means it will no longer be fit to be a mikvah. It doesn't mean that the water in it is necessarily tameh, that it is necessarily ritually impure. It just means that that container of water, that collection of water, better word, that collection of water could no longer grow up to be a kosher mikvah. That's all that's being stated. All right, now Rabbi Joshua is going to disagree. Used to say, any mikvah containing less than 40 sayas into which 3 logs of water fell, and from which a kortav was withdrawn, becomes valid, since the 3 logs have also been diminished. All right, so Rabbi Joshua, being the very clever man that he was, says, wait. Okay, fine. If you preserve the entirety of the original mikvah's water, then yes, there are 3 logs of water in the entire thing. But if you take out a little bit, just a little bit, well, you're probably also almost certainly taking at least a little bit of the water out that was the drawn water. And since you've removed the drawn water, well, presto changeo, now we've got a potentially kosher mikveh again, because some of that 3 logs has disappeared. And he's saying even a kortav or would be valid. And that is, as you can see from Dr. Kolb at the bottom, even 1/64th of a log of water. That is a tiny, tiny amount of water that he's saying could be removed. And now we are down to less than 3 logs. So we are perfectly fine. Carry on. Is that his position clear to everyone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But the sages say, as always, we have finished with, but not always, often we finish with the Hachamim. It always remains invalid until the amount of its former contents and a little more are removed. So the Hachamim say, wait, hold on. We need to reset the mikvah back to its pre-invalid state. So if we have, let me give you the example, if we had 20 seahs of water, and then the 3 logs fall into it, we have to remove from the mikvah enough that the amount of the former contents, the full 20 seahs, would be gone, and a little more would be removed, meaning the extra that was in from the login. Now, that sounds obvious. I keep using the expression drain the mikvah, but there is another way this could work, which is, let's imagine that you were at 39 seahs of Mayim Chayim, and then, John comes along and he wants to help, and he has a big bucket and he throws it in. John, what are you doing? Right? You can't do that. We can't have the, see, this is what happens by doing Mishnah late at night. Back up. We have our 20 seah mikvah, and then John comes in without us knowing and throws in a bucket with 3 logs of water. And then we come back and we allow the additional Mayim Chayim to flow in. We're going to talk about that later. And it gets up to 40 seahs. And John says, oh, good, you're done. Aren't you glad I put that bucket full in? And we go, John, how could you have done that? When did you put the bucket full in? He says, oh, it's when you took off for lunch. And we're like, all right, when I took off for lunch, there were 20 seahs. So that means I've got to drain the mikvah down from its 40, at least 20, plus a little bit more. And then I can begin refilling it from there. I have to go back to the reset point by draining it by the amount that it was at before it became invalid. So it's unlikely that a person would have that kind of situation. I mean, as you could tell, I had to really stretch the hypothetical to make it at all plausible, but technically that could happen, and you could draw off enough water to render the mikveh now to be assuredly down below that minimum. Now, as you can see, that is a different position than what Rabbi Joshua had, which is just remove a little water and you're fine. And it is a different position than our Rabbi Yossi, who said that once you have made it invalid, it can never be made invalid again, never be made valid again. So the Chachamim have a third and different position. Yes, Aaron.
So it's just out of curiosity, is the reasoning for this is that the entire mikvah is considered to be invalid water, so you have to get it below the 3 logs?
The idea here is that the entirety of the water you first put in has become intermingled with the drawn water, and as such, the entire water you first put in has to be removed. Now, keeping true to form, the rabbis are not going to demand that we tag and label each molecule of water that as being pre-invalidation and post-invalidation, but they are going to demand a quantity of water equal to the invalidated water to be removed, so that we have definitely, by rabbinic terms, removed the water that had been made invalid. Now, how can they do that? Isn't Rabbi Yossi right? Isn't it all invalid if it was invalid? Okay, well, again, as we go through Mikvaot, like through so many other parts of Mishnah, we have to remember that the invalidation, is that right? Is that a real English word? I can't speak English anymore. That the canceling of the potential validity of the mikvah is a rabbinic stringency, which means the rabbis are able, within the realm of their own logic and decision-making process, to add leniencies that they believe are appropriate, reasonable, and in keeping with both the Torah as well as the oral tradition that they have received. So yes, to a modern scientific analysis, the molecules are molecules, and once the molecules have changed their state, then you'd have to remove the exact same molecules, and the only way to be sure of that would be to empty the entire mikveh. But the rabbis are not scientists. Very important point. The rabbis are not scientists. They are analyzing halakha, which is a different job, every bit as important, and in my humble opinion, even more important, since it actually tells us how to live, not merely what to do to physically manipulate the world around us. The rabbis are reminding us that we are not bound by microscopic considerations. If you remove a quantity that is sufficient to have removed the amount that was cross-mingled with the drawn water, then you have done what was necessary and you can resume. Like I said, it is still a very unlikely circumstance that you would continue adding after the invalid water, the drawn water, was put in, but it is potentially possible and it can happen. We are going to get into a more likely situation in the next Mishnah, which is going to tell us a little bit more about how this draining and adding and all of that works. But let's finish up on any questions on Mishnah 1 before we get to Mishnah 2.
So going back to the example you said, if there was a 20 sayas in the mikvah and then you add 3 logs, you'd have to remove how much? 20 sayas?
Yes, and plus a little more.
So, and if you added 4 logs to the 20 salas, you'd have to move 21 salas in a little more, or just 20?
Right, the former contents, meaning the amount that was in it when it was invalidated. So yes, that would be, I guess, 20 plus 4 logim.
So if it's 20 plus 4 logs of drawn water, you said you'd remove the 20?
You'd remove the 20 and 4 more of for the log water, the logs of drawn water. The log, English, Hebrew. The additional drawn water quantity would have to be removed as well.
That's everything though.
Right, but like I said, somebody might, again, probably mistakenly, add 40 or add 20 that was fine, add 3 that was invalid, and then continue to add fine water, not realizing that they have already messed it up. And then when they come to the end, they would then have to remove a whole lot from the middle. Sorry, I thought I was on Do Not Disturb. And that would cause a, what's the right word? It would just, well, it'd be a more of a hullabaloo. And I can imagine a lot of consternation. Again, it's not likely, but it is possible that they would be removing the 20 plus the extra that was added off of a full mikvah of 40 or more, because they didn't realize that it had become invalid in the middle of the filling process. Mistakes happen is the short version. Natan, you've also have your hand up?
Yes, Rabbi. I understand the concept and the idea of the reboot, draining part of the water and filling again. I understand the logic, okay? But for me, what is bothering me a little, that is counterintuitive, because no matter how much you drain, still you mix good water with bad water. And when you drain, it's not like you know how to what is the other. So still when you try to reboot, you will still keep, let's call, bad water there, because it was mixed and you cannot differentiate it. So for me, my logic is that if you are so concerned, is you need to drain completely everything and start again. So in this way, you are 100% sure that everything that is there is an correct water from a correct source.
And that is a very stringent and scientific idea. But like I said, the Chachamim are not looking for a scientific analysis. They are not saying, I have my jar of acid and I want to empty it. I have to empty all of it if I want to make sure all of it's gone. Yes, that's absolutely right. But the rabbis are saying, look, the invalidation of drawn water is a stringency that is added by the rabbis. As far as we can tell, Deoraita, the Torah doesn't care between drawn water and Mayim Chayim, except in a very few number of circumstances. And most of those, we'll come to throughout the Masechet. So why should we require everything to be removed? We just need to get it back to a point where we feel more comfortable that the rabbinic stringency against drawn water will be observed. So this is a penalty, if you will, or a fine, if you will, that isn't actually correcting the problem perfectly, because correcting the problem perfectly is not required by the Torah. And so the rabbis are willing to cut a little slack in the process. And I know that feels weird. And that feels weird for two reasons. Like I said, one, in modern physical science studies, we would never say good enough when doing surgery. We would never say good enough when doing a physics experiment. It would just feel wrong. And indeed, it would be wrong. I want my surgeon to be sure that he got all of it out of me, not that he reduced most of the mix to the point where it seems okay. But like I said, this isn't science. The other Kishka's level, the gut feeling, is partly because many of us living in the 21st century have had our ideas about how do we best serve our faith, tainted, contaminated, mixed with fundamentalism of many different varieties. And that's something that is really a late 19th century and then into 20th and 21st century fixation that is not reflected in the words of the Hachamim. Of course, they are adamant that halakha be fulfilled, and they will demand that it be fulfilled as is needed. But they aren't going to demand that it be fulfilled the way it feels right, the way it feels that I am being loyal and committed to Torah. They want it to actually be loyal and committed. And if you don't feel like it was enough, well, okay. But that's a feeling that's a relatively modern feeling. Not to say that people weren't often superstitious or overzealous or excessively pious in the past. Of course they were as individuals. But as a general cultural trait, that type of fundamentalist thinking is relatively modern in the Western world from the middle of the 1800s onwards. For a whole variety of reasons, most of which have nothing to do with religion and a lot more to do with the upheaval of the political world that happened in the 1800s. Well, late 1700s and then 1800s is where it really got moving. All right, but that's more than we probably want to go into about the psychological influences of the modern era. Let's go ahead and move on to something that's a lot easier, the Mishnah 2. So as Dr. Kolb points out, Mishnah 2 is really a continuation of what we talked about what we do with a mikveh that had those 3 logs that fell into it. How can we make it valid again? How so? If there was a cistern in a courtyard and 3 logs of drawn water fell into it, it will always remain invalid until the whole of it is removed and a little more. Or, here we get a new option, until another mikveh containing 40 seyas is placed in the courtyard so that the higher mikveh is rendered valid by the lower. Okay, so here is option number 2. The first is drain out however much you need. The second option is you don't need to drain it, you just need to connect it to this other mikveh. And if you connect it to another kosher mikveh, very important that the other mikveh has already reached 40 seyas or more of Mayim Chayim, that it's a kosher water, then we can render that originally invalidated mikveh to be kosher. So as Dr. Kolb explains it, and I think he gives it a very good explanation, we're going to pick up here. The second way of validating the mikveh can work if there are 2 cisterns, 2 mikvaot in the courtyard. one higher than the other. The higher one is the one that has been made invalid, right? That's mikveh A. It is uphill. He can add water to this cistern so that it overflows, and the water will flow down into the lower cistern. That's mikveh B, which also has less than 40 seahs of water. The water flowing from the upper cistern will cause the lower one to have more than 40 seahs, and it will be pure. By virtue of its connection with the lower cistern, which is valid, the higher cistern is also valid as a mikveh. We shall learn more of this principle in chapter 6, Mishnah number 8. So we're not going to go into that in more details right now, because, like I said, we got 3 chapters to go before we'll dive in. But the idea here is that by linking mikveh A to mikveh B in a way that makes mikveh B kosher, it can also render mikveh A kosher through the linkage between the two of them. But I don't want to go into that any more in depth right now, because, like I said, or rather Dr. Kolb said, we're going to find out more about that in chapter 6. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah declares it invalid unless the new mikveh is stopped up. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that you have to make sure that that mikveh is plugged so that it is not flowing, because, as we talked about earlier in the earlier chapters, for a mikveh to be valid, it has to be the flow has to be stopped. But again, this is all going to be in much more detail in chapter 6. So let's just leave that on the back burner. Mishnah 3. If a cistern is full of drawn water and a channel leads into it and out of it, it continues to be invalid until it can be reckoned that there does not remain in it 3 loaves of former water. So here's another solution. We have our mikveh A, and we have a channel that is funneling rainwater into it, and then we have a channel out of it that is allowing overflow from the mikveh away from it. Okay, so now the water in the middle is being mingled with the new rainwater coming in, and is letting off excess downstream, if you will. If we can calculate that enough water has come in, that enough water has left, that we now have reached a threshold point, then mikveh A can be now considered a valid mikveh. So this is a way to reclaim the mikveh that had become contaminated without having to drain the whole thing. You are essentially flushing the system. And there was a lot more complicated math in the Gemara and the Halakha, which I am glad I'm not going to be teaching you tonight, because it gets complicated for the whole flow. But there is a way to work out how much water needs to go through in order for you to be confident that enough water has been flushed out, that what remains is a kosher mikveh. Does that general process make sense? If anybody's curious, let me know, and I can always send you where to go if you want to look at the math. Okay. If 2 men, we're now in a new situation. If 2 men each poured a log and a half of drawn water into a mikveh, or if 1 man wrung out his clothes and so poured in water from several places, you're squeezing it out of your clothes, so it's dripping from here, it's dripping from there, it's dripping from there. Or if 1 emptied out a water jug and so poured in water from several places, meaning that there were multiple holes from the jug draining down into the mikveh, but it's not coming out of 1 hole, but multiple places, Rabbi Akiva declares it valid. He says, as long as the water going in is coming from divided sources, and these are the different examples that he's giving of different types of division, that's okay. But the sages declare it invalid. Now, Rabbi Akiva gives us his thought process. Rabbi Akiva said, they did not say if they poured in, rather if 1 poured in, meaning that the the verbiage, as far as he's concerned, talks about a single pouring and not a plural pouring. Therefore, only a single pouring of the 3 loaves will render the mikvah invalid. But pouring up to that from multiple places, more than that from multiple places, does not render the mikvah invalid. But they, meaning the sages, have a rebuttal. They said neither thus nor thus, but rather if there fell in 3 loaves of drawn water. So they correct his version of the Mishnah. They are essentially saying the way you learned it, the verb that you used of being poured is not correct. Instead, the verb that we have from our version of the Mishnah that is more widely accepted is that it fell in as a just action. Therefore, the way it got in is immaterial. It doesn't matter whether it came in one lump sum. It doesn't matter whether it came from 2 guys or 1 guy. It doesn't matter if it came out of multiple holes from a bucket. If it went in, and that's all we need to know. So, well, first, are there any questions about the basic halakha here before we talk about what we can learn about the argument that these two are having?
I had a quick question.
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, does the previous Mishnah where we learned about the 3 cavities, does that assume that the sages are right here, or is that a different principle?
I haven't actually thought of comparing the two. I mean, my gut first response, without further analysis, is that it's a different principle, because that has to do with the timing at which it reaches the drawn water. But you are right that thinking of it with the idea that it's coming from multiple sources, but that doesn't matter. You know, if it didn't reach 40 seahs before that 3rd log, then it would be a big deal. So yes, that this does seem to be in harmony with that position of the 3 cavities. I'd have to go back and think about that some more, but yeah, I would say that it's not necessarily, but it does definitely look like it would be leaning that way. Yeah. All right, so yeah, that's all I can say off the top of my head. But it's an interesting question. But yeah, there does seem to be a parallel there. Now, what does this have to say more broadly? Well, this is reminding us that even from the point when the Mishnah was codified with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, even before the Mishnah was codified by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, that there were multiple versions of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, that different students would learn from their teachers, from their rabbis. Now, the basic halakha was always meant to be the same. Like I've referred to multiple times, 2 different teachers, both teaching algebra. The algebra doesn't change, but the examples they use and the methodology they use to explain it will change. But the answers from the students from the different classes should all be the same. But this is not exactly algebra. And that means that the answers that the next generation are going to generate could be different if there was a significant or important word choice that was being focused on by one student or another, that the teacher had not meant to be a relevant word choice. And here we see that played out. Rabbi Akiva is basically saying that his teacher taught him this very specific, if it was poured in a singular kind of verbiage, that means that it can come from multiple sources, but not a single sources. But the rest of the Chachamim are saying, that's not the way we learned it. We learned it with a slightly different phrasing, and our phrasing tells us that the number of sources is not the material issue here. And so this type of argument over which version of the text is clearest, is best, is very indicative of the rabbinic wrestling. It's something that will be argued about in a lot more detail when you study Talmud. And it is, of course, something that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi wanted to avoid, which is why the codification of the Mishnah was so important. But also we knew could not be completely avoided, which is why the other Braitot, the other teachings, and the Tosefta, the other collection of many of the other teachings were still maintained. We didn't burn the apocryphal texts or rule them out. We gave precedence to the Mishnah, but we would still double check the other Braitot, because sometimes from different traditions, the wording in those Braitot could be useful. But here they are shooting down the wording that Rabbi Akiva has brought. And actually, that is putting us past the 8 o'clock time, and I do have another obligation. So we're going to finish there, and we will pick up with Mishnah 4 from chapter 3 when we resume next week. Again, I'm sorry for my delay this evening, but my needs in the religious school just prevented me from getting here on time. And sorry for the technical difficulties with the sound system when I first got here.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, Shakova. Thank you for the show.